Imagine a man so ordinary his neighbors trusted him, his co-workers respected him, and his family believed he was harmless. Yet, beneath that mask of normalcy, he was dumping bodies along the river at night, so many that he couldn't even remember the number. This is the story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. The Green River snakes through Washington state like a quiet ribbon. Its waters cool, steady, and deceptively peaceful. Families fished along its banks, children skipped stones across the surface, and joggers traced the trails nearby. To the average eye, it was simply another stretch of the Pacific Northwest's natural beauty. But in the early 1980s, beneath its calm surface, the river carried secrets. Secrets of bodies. Secrets of girls who vanished into the night and never came home. For years, whispers haunted King County. Women, young, vulnerable, often runaways or sex workers, began to disappear at an alarming rate. At first, the police chalked it up to the risky lives many of them led, transient lifestyles that made them difficult to trace. But soon, the bodies began to surface. Some floated downstream, their lifeless forms tangled in reeds. Others were found half-buried in wooded clearings near the airport strip or dumped along lonely roadsides. The connection was undeniable. The killings were systematic, the cruelty deliberate, and the number of victims mounting at a terrifying pace. Detectives worked the cases tirelessly, but the killer seemed always a step ahead. He was a phantom in the night, someone who blended so easily into the ordinary fabric of life that his crimes took on an almost supernatural edge. Reporters dubbed him the Green River Killer. The name stuck, chilling residents and igniting a frenzy of fear that spread far beyond the banks of the river. What no one knew then was that the killer was not a shadowy drifter, not a wild-eyed stranger who prowled the highways under cover of darkness. He was a man who lived quietly among them, a man who worked steady jobs, attended church, and greeted his neighbors with a nod. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway. Born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, Gary grew up in an unstable household. His father was strict and unfeeling, his mother domineering and volatile. Gary would later describe his mother's obsessive behavior, her control over his life, her harsh punishments, her unpredictable mood swings. He wet the bed well into his teens, and when it happened, his mother would berate him, scrub him clean, sometimes in ways that left him both humiliated and confused. Those moments, buried deep in his subconscious, fused shame with arousal, punishment with desire. In Gary's mind, dominance and violence became entangled with intimacy. Neighbors and classmates remembered him as slow, someone who struggled academically and socially. Yet behind his dull eyes and awkward smile, a different persona began to take shape, one that would emerge in terrifying form as he grew older. By adulthood, Gary Ridgway was the picture of ordinariness. He worked as a truck painter, a reliable if unremarkable man who married multiple times and went largely unnoticed in the sprawl of suburban Washington. But inside, a storm raged. He harbored fantasies of control, of power over women, and above all, of erasing them when they no longer served his purpose. The killings began in 1982. Gary cruised the streets near Seattle's Seattle-Tacoma Airport, a known hub for sex workers. He learned their rhythms, the way they operated, who was new, who was desperate. He presented himself as harmless, a man in a pickup truck, offering money, a ride, maybe a bit of company. They saw him as another faceless client, nothing unusual. But once inside his vehicle, their fates were sealed. Gary would drive them to secluded spots, wooded trails, quiet riverbanks, abandoned lots. Then, with chilling calmness, he strangled them, often with his bare hands, sometimes using ligatures like shoelaces or cords. The act was swift, intimate, and deliberate. It gave him the sense of power he craved. But Gary's cruelty didn't end with death. He returned to the bodies, sometimes days or weeks later, to perform acts of necrophilia. He confessed years later that revisiting the corpses extended the thrill, that it made him feel in control even after life had left their bodies. The Green River became his dumping ground, a silent accomplice that carried away evidence and concealed his horrors. As the number of victims grew, so did the panic. By 1984, dozens of women were missing, their families left in anguish. their photos filling the walls of police stations. Detectives formed the Green River Task Force, one of the largest criminal investigations in U.S. history. They combed through evidence, conducted endless interviews, and even brought in experts like FBI profiler John Douglas to build a psychological portrait of the killer. The profile was chillingly accurate. A man who blended into society, with a steady job, possibly married, and with an insatiable hatred for women, particularly sex workers. The killer was methodical but not brilliant, driven by compulsion more than genius. Detectives believed he lived in the Seattle area, that he knew the streets and the river intimately. And they were right, yet Gary Ridgway remained free. For nearly 2 decades, he slipped through the cracks. Investigators questioned him more than once, even administered a polygraph test, which he passed. His name appeared on their lists, but there was never enough to hold him. Meanwhile, the bodies kept surfacing. Overgrown graves in the woods, bones scattered by animals, skeletal remains hidden under brush. Each discovery reopened wounds, and yet the killer continued his grim work. Gary Ridgway was more than a predator, he was a paradox. To his neighbors, he was the friendly man next door who mowed his lawn, waved hello, and seemed utterly unremarkable. To his wives and girlfriends, he was controlling, often violent, consumed by jealousy and an insatiable sexual appetite. He could be charming when he wanted, but his charm was thin, a mask that barely covered his true nature. Behind the mask was an emptiness that only killing could fill. The Green River Task Force worked around the clock. Detectives pinned maps to walls, dotted with pushpins marking where bodies had been found. Red strings connected one discovery to another, patterns emerging like spiderwebs. Yet no matter how many lines they drew, the threads all seemed to end in the same place. Nowhere. The killer left behind little evidence. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA that technology at the time could identify. The frustration gnawed at investigators. They knew they were hunting a man who lived among them, someone who could drive past their roadblocks, smile at their press conferences, and watch their failures from the safety of his living room. Each new body they found felt like a personal failure, a taunt from a killer who seemed invisible. Meanwhile, Gary Ridgway continued his life with disturbing normalcy. He married again, attended church regularly, and worked his steady job painting trucks at the Kenworth plant. To his co-workers, Gary was dependable, maybe a little odd but never dangerous. He carried a lunchbox, cracked jokes, and clocked in and out like everyone else. He blended so perfectly into the background that no one thought twice about him. That was his camouflage, ordinariness. But away from work, Gary prowled. He knew the neighborhoods where vulnerable women lingered. He'd pull over, soft-spoken and smiling, convincing them he was just another lonely man looking for company. His methods were chillingly consistent. Once he gained their trust enough to get them into his pickup truck, he drove to a remote area. There, the mask came off. He strangled them. Sometimes with his hands, sometimes with ligatures, sometimes even using the victim's own clothing. What made Ridgway particularly terrifying was his lack of remorse. In later confessions, he admitted that strangling women was easier than stabbing or shooting because it was less messy and gave him control. He would look into their eyes as they took their final breaths, absorbing their fear, savoring the feeling of power. Then he discarded their bodies like trash, dumping them in clusters so he could remember where to return. Yes, Ridgway returned to his victims. That was his darkest ritual. Days or weeks later, he would visit the sites where he left the bodies, engaging in necrophilia. The corpses became objects of possession for him, extensions of his fantasies. Over time, when decomposition made this impossible, he sought new victims, feeding an endless cycle of compulsion. Detectives knew the killer was taunting them with his methods. Bodies turned up in clusters, groups of women discarded near one another, as though he was daring police to connect them. The task force grew desperate. Theories swirled. Was the Green River killer a trucker, constantly moving? A local man with intimate knowledge of the terrain? Or someone within law enforcement, using insider knowledge to evade capture? As pressure mounted, investigators interviewed hundreds of suspects. One name appeared again and again, Gary Ridgway. He had been seen with sex workers in the Seattle-Tacoma area. He drove a pickup. He matched the psychological profile almost perfectly. Detectives brought him in for questioning in 1983. They asked him about the murders, about the women. Gary smiled, shrugged, denied. His answers were calm, steady, too steady. He even agreed to take a polygraph test. And he passed. It was a devastating blow to the investigation. Polygraphs, though far from perfect, were heavily relied upon in the 1980s. Detectives reluctantly crossed Gary off their primary suspect list. He slipped through their fingers, free once again to continue killing. Years dragged on. The body count rose. By the late 1980s, the Green River Killer was suspected of more than 40 murders. The community lived in fear. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone. Sex workers whispered among themselves, warning one another to watch for a man in a pickup. But the warnings rarely saved anyone. The killer was patient, persuasive, and relentless. Ridgway, for his part, compartmentalized his life with chilling precision. At home, he played the role of devoted husband. He attended church, where he was known for reading the Bible aloud. To neighbors, he was just Gary, quiet, reliable, boring. At work, he painted trucks, chatting about sports and weather with coworkers. No one suspected the man who clocked in beside them each morning was also strangling women at night. But behind the mask, cracks were forming. Ridgway's relationships fell apart. His marriages crumbled under his controlling behavior and insatiable demands. Coworkers noted he could be strange, overly interested in prostitutes, constantly seeking sex. Police, though still without hard evidence, never fully let him go. His name lingered in their files like a shadow. In the 1990s, forensic science advanced. DNA technology became more reliable, able to match biological evidence with greater accuracy. Detectives revisited old cases, testing samples from victims' bodies. In 1987, they had taken a saliva swab from Gary Ridgway during one of their many interviews. At the time, it yielded nothing. But years later, technology caught up. By the late 1990s, DNA evidence began to whisper the truth. In 2001, the whispers became a scream. DNA linked Gary Ridgway to several Green River victims. The man who had eluded the largest task force in American history for 2 decades was finally unmasked. When detectives arrested him outside the Kenworth plant, Gary Ridgway didn't fight. He didn't protest. He didn't demand to know why. He simply went quietly, almost as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. When Gary Ridgway sat down in that stark interrogation room in 2001, the weight of nearly 2 decades of bloodshed hovered in the air. He was not frantic, not defensive, not even visibly remorseful. Instead, his voice was steady, almost calm. The same voice he had used to lure vulnerable women into his truck before leading them to their deaths. Detectives expected resistance, denial, maybe a rehearsed alibi. What they received instead was a chilling wave of honesty. "I killed so many women," he confessed flatly, "that I lost count." The words landed like a hammer. Some investigators shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, while others scribbled furiously in their notebooks, desperate to capture the enormity of what was unfolding. Ridgway's face betrayed little emotion, but his words painted a picture of cold calculation. He explained how he targeted women, mostly sex workers and runaways, because he believed no one would miss them. They were easy targets, as he called them, women whose disappearances would not stir media outrage or trigger relentless searches. To Ridgway, they were invisible souls, easily discarded, quickly forgotten. But his methodical recollections cut deeper. He admitted to strangling most of his victims with his bare hands. "Choking was personal," he said. "I could see the life leave their eyes. I liked it because it was quiet, and I felt in control." Detectives listened in horror as Ridgway detailed how he would dump the bodies in wooded areas along the Green River or other secluded places he knew well. He admitted to returning to the sites, sometimes having sex with the corpses. He claimed it wasn't about lust alone. It was about ownership, about exerting power long after death. The depravity of his confessions shook even the most hardened lawmen in the room. One investigator later described it as listening to evil in its purest form. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Ridgway's account was the casual tone with which he spoke. To him, these memories were not haunting nightmares. They were logistics, steps in a process. He remembered the details not as traumas but as a mechanic might recall replacing a part. Still, every so often, a flicker of humanity slipped through. When asked why he cooperated so openly, Ridgway gave a response that baffled many. "I wanted to help bring closure," he said. "I wanted families to know what happened to their daughters." It was a grotesque irony, a killer who caused immeasurable grief claiming to provide comfort. Yet his cooperation did help authorities identify remains, close dozens of cases, and return lost daughters to grieving families. However late and painful the truth came. In exchange for his full confession and cooperation, Ridgway avoided the death penalty. Instead, he received 49 consecutive life sentences without parole. For the families who had spent decades waiting for answers, it was a bittersweet outcome. Justice was delivered, but in Ridgway's survival, there remained a bitter reminder. He would breathe, eat, and exist long after their daughters had been buried. Courtrooms overflowed during his sentencing. Parents, siblings, and children of the victims faced him, many delivering impact statements that spoke to the unbearable weight of loss. Some cursed him, some demanded he rot in prison, and others spoke of forgiveness, choosing not to let hatred consume what remained of their lives. Ridgway, however, sat largely motionless, avoiding eye contact. The only time he appeared to break was when one father told him, "You have destroyed families forever. You stole futures. You stole daughters. But I forgive you." Tears filled Ridgway's eyes, and for a brief second, the mask slipped. Whether it was genuine remorse or simply discomfort at being faced with such unshakable humanity, no one could be sure. Today, Gary Ridgway remains behind bars, one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Officially convicted of 49 murders, investigators believe the true number could be over 70. He blended into society, hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades, proof of how ordinary evil can appear. His crimes forever altered Washington state. The Green River itself, once a peaceful ribbon of water winding through the Pacific Northwest, became synonymous with horror. Families never forgot, and law enforcement never stopped asking themselves how Ridgway could have been missed for so long. In the end, Ridgway's story isn't only about murder. It's about the cracks in a system that allowed a predator to thrive, about women's society dismissed as expendable, and about how evil can lurk behind the most unassuming faces. Gary Ridgway's chilling words, "I killed so many women, I lost count," still echo in the halls of justice. For decades, he evaded capture, hiding his monstrous crimes behind the mask of an ordinary man. But perhaps the most unsettling question isn't just how many women he killed. It's how many predators like him are still hiding in plain sight today.